Lyndon Johnson made his famous speech on 64, excuse me, when Lyndon Johnson made his famous speech on civil rights and equal opportunity. And what he said was that if you put a man in chains and you hold him back for over 100 years, and then you remove those chains and you bring him up to the starting line and you expect him to run the race like the other runner who had been planning for this and training for the race and had never been in chains, then the race is inherently unfair, and that there was an obligation for anyone to be fair to give the man who had been in chains some assistance so that he could run a better race. That was the way Lyndon Johnson at Howard University in 1964 explained the rationale for affirmative action. That's what he meant by that. And that's what he tried to do, but then came the Vietnam War. And the massive spending for the Vietnam War began to reduce the federal government's capacity to spend as much as had been spent on social programs aimed at the cities. And then another thing happened, the riots themselves. When the riots occurred, I think many people in the leadership sector of the country, and especially white liberals, began to question whether or not they were on the right track. And a group known as neoconservatives began to emerge. They were people who began to say, well, maybe it really isn't a problem of economic inequality. There are some other forces at work here. Values, attitudes, and behavior. Maybe it's culture. You began to hear about this thing called the culture of poverty. Maybe it is something within the people themselves rather than the objective conditions of their disadvantage that explains why they are not advancing more, and maybe we've been doing the wrong thing all the time, so perhaps we should reduce this spending and move in a different direction. A very important memorandum was written in 1970. I believe that was a year, by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who in 1964 wrote a very famous report on the Negro family, in which he attributed many of the conditions of economic disadvantage in the black community to a breakdown of the black family. He had misread the previous literature, let me say. But by 1970, he was in the White House as Richard Nixon's principal domestic advisor. And he wrote a memorandum in which he suggested that the federal government's high visibility concentration on these problems might itself be the problem, that the country was ripe for benign neglect. He claimed that the way to deal with these problems was to draw attention away from them. We needed benign neglect, he said. Well, it was an exceedingly poor choice of words. And it was an indication, though, of the so-called neoconservative thinking that pervaded the body politic at that time and led to a shifting away from the kind of high visibility government concentration on urban problems reflected in such programs as the Model Cities program, the Great Society programs. And of course, in the late 1960s, the early 1970s, the funding for those programs was reduced rather sharply.
Why do so many folks over 40 with type 2 start walking like this? If you take metformin and know